The phone was in my hand before I was fully awake. 4:47 a.m., the screen said. My mother's name glowing in the dark like something urgent, something that couldn't wait. I answered because I always answered. That was the first thing you needed to know about me. My name is Nora. I was 34 years old, an elementary school art teacher in Cloverfield, Ohio, and for most of my adult life I had operated under the quiet, unexamined belief that my family needed me more than I needed them. I held their emergencies. I remembered their anniversaries. I drove the 3 hours to my parents' house when the furnace broke, when my father had his knee surgery, when my sister Krista needed someone to sit with her through a breakup she described as the worst pain she had ever felt, which, at the time, I believed, because I had never seen her cry like that before. The call at 4:47 a.m. was not an emergency. My mother's voice was perfectly steady. What she said was this: "Nora, honey, I need you to understand something before you hear it from someone else." I sat up. The room was dark. My husband Daniel was still asleep beside me, his breathing slow and even, and I remember looking at him for a second, at the shape of him under the blankets, and feeling something cold settle into my chest before my mother had said another word. "We're not going to be able to make it to the wedding." 6 months earlier, Daniel and I had set the date. We had chosen September 14th because it fell on a Saturday and because the venue, a restored barn outside of town with string lights and a creek running behind it, was available and perfect and cost more than I was comfortable spending, but I had said yes anyway because Krista had told me it was the most beautiful place she had ever seen. That detail would matter later. It mattered a great deal. The wedding was in 11 days. I said. Just that one word. Your father and I. And honey, Krista can't make it either. I didn't speak. Outside, something moved in the yard. A branch against the window, maybe, or just the wind making the kind of sound that feels like a warning in hindsight. I was sitting in the dark with a phone pressed to my ear, and my mother was explaining, steadily, gently, with the particular patience she used when she had already decided something, that my sister's passport had been delayed, that they had booked a trip to help her pick it up in person from an office in another city, that it was all very complicated and last minute, and of course they were heartbroken. "A passport office," I said. "These things happen, Nora." What I felt in that moment was not anger. Not yet. What I felt was the specific, disorienting sensation of a floor that you thought was solid turning slightly soft beneath your feet. I had been standing on this particular floor my entire life. I had never noticed the give in it before. I told her I understood. I told her I would let the venue know about the head count. I told her it was fine. I said the word fine twice, which should have told me something about how fine it actually was. I hung up. Daniel had turned over in his sleep. I put the phone face down on the nightstand and sat there in the dark for a long time, not crying, not thinking clearly, just existing in the strange suspension of a moment you know is important but haven't fully processed yet. The wedding happened without them. It was beautiful, the string lights, the creek, the 63 people who showed up and ate and danced and told Daniel and me that we were wonderful together. My best friend Simone stood beside me at the altar and squeezed my hand when my voice wobbled during the vows. My Aunt Renee, my father's sister, sat in the front row where my parents should have been and cried the whole way through, and she wasn't even a crier. My mother sent flowers. White lilies, which I was allergic to, which she knew, because I had told her twice. I put them outside on the porch. By morning they had started to wilt in the September heat. I told myself it was a coincidence, the flowers, the allergy, the wilt. I told myself my mother had simply forgotten, because she was distracted, because she had a lot going on. That was something I was very good at, finding the most generous possible explanation and living inside it until it became the truth I needed. That was the pattern. I just didn't have a name for it yet. The weeks after the wedding were quiet in the way that trouble is quiet before it isn't. Daniel and I settled into our new apartment. We had moved to a slightly larger place in July, close enough to my school that I could walk on dry days. He worked in urban planning for the city, often coming home with rolled blueprints under his arm and a specific kind of tired that meant he'd been in meetings for hours without a real break. We made dinner together most nights. We talked. We were, genuinely and without performance, happy. My family's absence at the wedding sat in the room with us sometimes, though neither of us named it directly. Daniel had said what he needed to say the morning after, quiet, measured, his hand over mine at the kitchen table, and then he had let me set the pace for how we talked about it. That was one of the things I loved about him. He never pushed. My mother called the following Sunday, as she always did. She asked how the honeymoon planning was going, whether we'd picked a destination. She did not mention the wedding. I did not bring it up. We talked for 22 minutes about her garden, my father's knee, whether Krista was eating enough because she'd looked thin at. My mother stopped herself there, mid-sentence, and the pause lasted only half a second, but I heard it. At where? I asked. At dinner last week. We had her over. I wrote a permission slip for a third grader named Marcus that afternoon and stared at the words for a full minute before I realized I'd spelled his name wrong. Small things were breaking my concentration in ways I didn't expect. A remark at school from a colleague, "Your family must have been so proud." A photo my Aunt Renee posted, me and Daniel at the altar, that my parents hadn't liked or commented on, which I noticed only because I'd looked for it, which meant some part of me had already started keeping score without telling the rest of me. Krista texted me 11 days after the wedding. Not a call, a text. "So sorry we missed it. You looked gorgeous from the photos. Lunch soon?" I stared at that message for a long time. From the photos. Not I saw the photos and they made me feel terrible for missing it. Not I'm devastated we weren't there. Just from the photos, like a caption. Like we were acquaintances who had attended different events and were catching up across the distance. I said yes to lunch. Of course I did. Because saying no felt like making a thing of it, and making a thing of it felt aggressive, and I was not. I had spent 34 years carefully not being the kind of woman who made things of it. Lunch was at a cafe on Birch Street that Krista had chosen. She was late by 12 minutes, which she acknowledged with a hand on my arm and a smile and no further comment. She looked good. Tanned, actually, which struck me as odd for late September in Ohio. She had a new haircut. She was wearing earrings I hadn't seen before, gold, delicate, the kind that weren't cheap. We talked for an hour. She asked about the wedding, complimented the dress based on photos, said the barn venue sounded exactly like what she would have chosen. That sentence landed strangely. I let it pass. She did not explain the passport story. I did not ask. Afterward, walking to my car, I felt the specific exhaustion that comes not from physical activity but from the sustained effort of performing normalcy while carrying something heavy underneath it. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. My hands were in my lap. I looked at the back of them, the knuckles, the plain gold band Daniel had placed on my finger 11 days ago. From the photos, Krista had said. I started the car. I drove home. I made dinner. I did not say anything to Daniel about the tan, the earrings, the sentence about the barn being exactly what she would have chosen. I didn't say anything because I hadn't put it together yet. Or because some quieter part of me had started to, and I was not ready for what came next if I let that thought finish itself. October arrived cold and fast, the way Ohio Octobers do. One morning you wake up and summer is simply gone, no gradual fade, just the sudden reality of bare trees and breath you can see. I had 31 students that year, ages 7 to 9, and teaching art to children that age is one of the most honest things I know how to do. They don't hide what they feel about the work. If something is boring, their bodies say so. If something surprises them, a color mixing into an unexpected shade, a shape emerging from what looked like a mistake, their faces open completely. I have always trusted children's reactions more than adults. Adults have learned to perform. I was thinking about performance a lot that month. The first thing that didn't fit was a photo. Simone, my best friend, my maid of honor, the woman who had squeezed my hand at the altar, posted something on a Tuesday night in early October. A throwback, she said. Her and Krista at a rooftop bar, arms around each other, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. The timestamp in the corner of the photo was September 14th. September 14th. My wedding day. I looked at it for a long time. Simone and Krista were not particularly close, or at least I had always understood them not to be. They knew each other through me, the way people orbit a common point without directly connecting. But there they were. Rooftop bar. My wedding day. Both of them laughing. I told myself there was an explanation. Maybe Simone had posted a mislabeled throwback. Maybe the timestamp was wrong. I did not ask Simone about it directly because I told myself I was being paranoid, and I had spent my whole life being told gently, lovingly, consistently, that my instincts were an overreaction. My mother had a word for it. She called it Nora's spiraling, as if my capacity to notice things was a disorder rather than a sense. The second thing, my father called me on a Wednesday, which he almost never did. My father was a quiet man, not cold, but contained, a man who expressed affection through doing rather than saying. He called to ask about a recipe, which was so unlike him that I almost laughed. He wanted to know how I made that lemon cake I used to bring to Sunday dinners. We talked for 4 minutes. Before he hung up, he said, in a different register than anything else in the conversation, "You know your mother loves you, Nora. She's been under a lot of stress lately." I said I knew. After we hung up, I sat with that sentence. The unfinished thought. The appeal without explanation. My father had called to deliver a message, and the message was, "Don't push." He was protecting something, or someone, and the protection was so instinctive that he didn't even know he was doing it. Looking back, I think that phone call was the moment I began to genuinely accept that something had happened, not just that my family had made a difficult choice, but that there was a story beneath the passport story, and that everyone around me already knew it. The third thing was the one that cracked the surface. Simone and I met for coffee on a Friday. We did this every few weeks, a local place called Gravel and Grounds, mismatched chairs, too loud music, the best oat milk latte in Cloverfield. We had been doing this for 6 years. It was one of the most comfortable routines of my adult life. She was distracted. I noticed it immediately. She kept checking her phone, not in the obvious way but in the way people do when they're trying not to be obvious, small glances every few minutes, the phone face up on the table instead of face down. Simone always put her phone face down when we had coffee. She had told me once that it was a rule she made for herself. Presence, she called it. She was very intentional about presence. At one point, a message came through and she turned the phone over before I could see the screen, but I saw the name at the top of the notification. Just the name. One word. Krista. I kept my face still. This was something I had become very good at, keeping my face still while something shifted underneath it. I smiled at whatever Simone was saying. I asked a follow-up question. I finished my coffee. We hugged outside on the sidewalk and said we'd do this again soon, and I walked to my car and drove home and sat in the parking lot of my apartment building for 8 minutes. Krista and Simone were texting. Frequently enough that a message arrived during a Friday morning coffee. Secretly enough that Simone had a rule about hiding her screen. I had introduced them. I had been the center point. And somewhere in the past year, or longer, maybe much longer, they had formed something between themselves that deliberately excluded me. The question I couldn't answer yet was, what were they protecting? I want to be honest about what I did next, because it wasn't clean or straightforward. I didn't behave like someone calm and rational. I behaved like someone who had realized, slowly and against her will, that the people closest to her had been living in a version of events she wasn't invited into, and who needed to know how far back the exclusion went. I started paying attention in a way I hadn't allowed myself to before. I went back through my own memory of the past year and looked at it differently. The way Simone had always been careful about what she said when I talked about Krista. Not critical, not overly complimentary, just measured. A particular neutrality I had read as maturity and was now rereading as something else. The way Krista had known things about my life, small things, contextual things, that I hadn't told her directly. She had mentioned once, in passing, that she knew Daniel had been stressed about a project at work. I had not told Krista about Daniel's work stress. But I had told Simone. Sleep became something that happened in pieces. I would wake at 2 or 3, lying still in the dark while Daniel breathed steadily beside me, and my mind would be running, not spiraling. I want to be clear about that distinction, not panicking, but working. Assembling. I was putting together a picture I had been refusing to look at. My appetite shifted too. I ate dinner because it was dinner time, not because I was hungry. My hands developed a restlessness I didn't know what to do with. I started working on a large canvas at home in the evenings, something I hadn't done in years, and the painting became very dark very quickly in a way that surprised me. In late October, I called my cousin Becca, my father's niece, who had grown up near us and who had always been adjacent to family events without being fully inside the system. Becca was 41, a nurse, someone who said what she thought with a cheerful bluntness that had always made me slightly uncomfortable and now felt like the most valuable quality in the world. I asked her, as casually as I could manage, whether she'd heard anything about why my family hadn't come to the wedding. There was a pause on her end. Not long. But shaped. "What did your mom tell you?" she asked. The passport story. Krista's passport being delayed. Another pause. Nora. Just tell me. What Becca told me came in pieces, and she prefaced each piece with "I'm not sure of all of it and this is just what I heard," but the shape of it was clear enough. In early September, approximately 2 weeks before my wedding, my mother had hosted what she called a small family gathering. Becca had not been invited. My Aunt Renee, who had sat in the front row at my wedding and cried, had not been invited. It had been my parents, Krista, and Krista's boyfriend Marcus, whom none of us knew well. And Simone. Simone had been there. At this gathering, according to what Becca had pieced together from a conversation with Renee, something had been announced. Something that required planning. Something, and this is where Becca's information grew uncertain, that was connected to a trip. What kind of trip? I asked. I honestly don't know the details. Renee just said it all felt strange. That your mom was acting like it was the most exciting thing in the world and didn't understand why Renee wasn't more enthusiastic. And Renee asked about the wedding and your mom said, and this is Renee's words, she said, "Nora will understand." I was in the school supply closet when Becca told me this. I had stepped in there to make the call during my prep period. I was sitting on an overturned plastic bin surrounded by construction paper and dried-out markers, and I pressed my free hand flat against the shelf in front of me and held it there. Nora will understand. I had been cast, somewhere in my own family's story, as the one who could be counted on to absorb things quietly. The one whose feelings were always last on the list. Not because anyone was deliberately cruel, I don't think it was deliberate, and that almost made it worse, but because I had spent 34 years making it easy for people to assume that I was fine. That I would be fine. That my fineness was structural and permanent and didn't require maintenance. The flaw I had never named in myself was this: I had built my entire sense of worth around being the person who held things together, and in doing so I had made it nearly impossible for anyone to notice when I was the one falling apart. I sat in the supply closet for 6 minutes after I hung up with Becca. Then I washed my face in the staff bathroom, went back to my classroom, and taught a lesson on watercolor blending to 28 8-year-olds who needed me to be present. And I was present. That was the strange thing. I could still do that. But something had hardened in me. Not in the cold way, not bitterness. In the way that bone does after a fracture heals. denser, less willing to bend. I needed to understand what Simone's role was in this. That was the thread I couldn't let go. I didn't know it then. This is what she was living with, the version of events I would only understand later when she finally told me. I had known about Krista's plan for almost 4 months. She'd called me in May, right after your engagement party, and she was so excited. That's the thing I need you to understand. She was so excited, and she pulled me into it the way Krista pulls everyone into everything, that energy she has, and I said yes before I understood what yes meant. She said she needed someone in your life who could help her manage the timing. That's the word she used. Manage. I told myself I wasn't lying to you. I was just not telling you yet. That there would be a right moment. And then there wasn't. And then the wedding was happening and I was standing at the altar with you and you were so happy and I felt sick the entire time. I was sick that whole day. But I didn't stop it. I didn't say anything. And that is the thing I will not forgive myself for. What I found, the week before I said anything to anyone, was the Instagram account. Krista had a secondary account, a travel account, one of those curated things with a geographic handle, that I had never known about. A mutual acquaintance of ours had tagged it in a comment, and I found it by accident, scrolling through a thread about places in Greece. The account had 47 posts. It had been active for 14 months. The most recent post was dated September 14th. It was a photo of a terrace overlooking the Aegean Sea. White stone, blue water, a table with 2 glasses of wine, the light the specific honeygold of late afternoon in the Greek islands. The caption said, "Sometimes you build the life you actually want." She had been in Santorini on my wedding day. Not delayed at a passport office. Not navigating a complicated bureaucratic situation with our parents' help. She had been in Greece with Marcus, on what I now understood, slowly, with the particular nausea of something becoming undeniable, was likely her own honeymoon. Or the equivalent of one. My parents had skipped my wedding to help Krista leave for Santorini. And Simone had known. I called my mother on a Sunday morning in early November. Daniel was out. He had an early run, a habit he kept even in cold weather, and I had the apartment to myself. I had not told him what I'd found yet. I needed to do this first. I had planned to be calm. I had rehearsed calm. I had gone through, in my head, a version of this conversation where I was measured and precise and gave my mother no opening to redirect. What actually happened was something I had not expected from myself. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and Sunday morning easy, and she said Nora, honey, the way she always did, and something in me cracked sideways. I know about Santorini, I said. A pause. Not long, but shaped, the way Becca's had been, in a way that told me everything about what she was deciding in that half-second. I don't know what you. I found the account, Mom. The Instagram account. September 14th. The terrace, the wine, the caption. My voice was not the voice I had rehearsed. It was faster than that, and lower, and had something in it I didn't recognize immediately. You skipped my wedding so you could help Krista leave for her honeymoon. Her unofficial honeymoon. Whatever it was. You drove her to the airport. Nora. 11 days before my wedding you called me at 5 in the morning and told me a story about a passport office. The word story came out with a force I hadn't planned. I heard my own voice fill the room and understood, somewhere beneath the adrenaline, that this was a version of me I hadn't met before. Not theatrical. Not hysterical. Just, finally done managing the temperature of everyone else's comfort at the expense of my own truth. That story was partially true, my mother said, and her voice had shifted too, no longer warm, now careful in the way that meant she was finding her footing. There were real complications with Krista's documents. The complications were a cover. The reason was that she had already booked the trip and needed you there. And you chose that over my wedding. I stopped. Breathed. My wedding, Mom. Mine and Daniel's. Which we planned for 8 months. Which you helped me pick flowers for. Which you told me you were so excited about. I was excited. I am. Nora, you have to understand, Krista needed us. She was going through something. She and Marcus had this window before his work travel schedule. She didn't need you. And there it was, the anger I hadn't known I had fully surfaced now, clear and precise. She wanted you there. She wanted a trip. She is 29 years old and she wanted a vacation, and she told you I would understand, and you believed her because it was easier than telling her no. Because you have never in my life told Krista no. Silence. That's not fair, my mother said quietly. Which part of it isn't fair? Name it. Another pause. And then, not immediately, not cleanly, but with the grinding certainty of a gear that's been stripped, she said, you've always been the strong one, Nora. You've always been the one who manages. We knew you would be okay. You had Daniel. You had your friends. Krista doesn't have the same, she needs more support. She always has. I sat with that for exactly 3 seconds. And then I said, you just told me that I matter less because I seem like I can handle things. You know that's what you said. She did not answer. You taught me to be the strong one, I said. My voice was quieter now, not softer. Quieter the way a room gets quiet when something important has been said and hasn't been absorbed yet. You taught me to hold everything together and not complain and not make things difficult. And then you used that against me. You skipped my wedding because you knew I would manage. You sent lilies because I would manage. You let Simone know and kept me out because I would manage. And the whole time you were patting yourself on the back for raising such a capable daughter. I heard my mother draw a breath. What came next was the part that told me how deep this ran. Simone was supportive. She understood the situation. She helped Krista feel less guilty about the timing. Simone was at your planning dinner. In September. 2 weeks before my wedding. She stood at my altar and held my hand while knowing everything. I asked her not to say anything because I didn't want to upset you before. You used my best friend to manage me. The word again. Manage. A word I had turned over so many times in the past 3 weeks that it had worn smooth. You used the person I trusted most to make sure I stayed in the dark long enough for Krista to be in Greece without consequences. My mother was crying now. I could hear it, the controlled, dignified kind of crying she had always done, the kind that arrived as a signal that the conversation should adjust around her feelings. I had always adjusted. Automatically, reflexively, without even noticing the adjustment was happening. I didn't adjust. I am not angry that you love Krista, I said. I am angry that you love her at my expense. Consistently, across our entire lives, at my expense. And you have never once acknowledged it because you've needed me to believe it wasn't happening. She said my name. Just my name. I need some time, I told her. Don't call me. I'll call you when I'm ready. I hung up. My hands were shaking. I pressed them both flat on the kitchen table and looked at them until the shaking stopped, which took longer than I expected. Outside, a car moved slowly past on the wet November street. The apartment was very quiet. I had the strange sensation of existing in a space that was the same as it had been an hour ago but somehow had different dimensions, as if the walls had shifted slightly, making the room larger than before. The confrontation with Simone happened 2 days later. I had asked her to meet me at Gravel and Grounds and she had said yes without asking why, which meant she already knew. She arrived before me. She was sitting at the back table, not our usual table, with her hands wrapped around a mug and her face set in the particular expression of someone who has been bracing for something. I sat down. I looked at her. I had prepared, again, for calm. And again I found something else, not the same hot anger from the call with my mother, but something more complicated. Something that had grief in it, because this was Simone, and 6 years is a long time, and she had squeezed my hand at the altar and I had felt that squeeze as love. How long? I asked. She didn't pretend not to know what I meant. That was something, I suppose. May, she said. After your engagement party. Krista called me. She said she needed someone who knew you well enough to help her figure out the timing. I know how that sounds. It sounds like she recruited you. She did. Simone's voice was steady but her eyes weren't. And I said yes because she made it sound like it was already decided and she just needed support. And then it snowballed and the wedding date was set and the trip was booked and every point where I could have said something I didn't because it would have meant admitting I'd already been quiet too long. She stopped. I know there's no version of that, that's okay. You held my hand at my wedding. I know. You knew my family wasn't there and why, and you held my hand and let me believe it was a passport. Yes. Her voice broke on the word. I know what I did. I've known every day since. I sat with that for a moment. There was a part of me that wanted to accept the remorse, that recognized it as genuine, that wanted to reach across and say I understand, we can fix this. That part of me was very old and very practiced. I had been using it my entire life to smooth things back to comfortable before I'd had the chance to feel how bad they actually were. I didn't use it this time. I love you, I said. I need you to know that first. But I can't talk to you right now. I don't know when I can. And I need you to respect that without trying to fix it, because trying to fix it is what you do when someone else's discomfort is more uncomfortable than your own guilt. She nodded. She was crying. I was not. I left enough for both coffees on the table and walked out into the November cold and kept walking for 3 blocks before I stopped and stood on the sidewalk and breathed. The sky was low and gray. My hands were in my coat pockets. And underneath the grief and the anger and the exhaustion, something else was beginning, something quieter and more permanent. The first faint recognition that the version of Nora who would have gone back in there and apologized for leaving was not the version currently standing on this sidewalk. This is what Krista finally said to me, 6 weeks after the confrontation, when she drove to Cloverfield because I had stopped answering her messages. She stood in my doorway. I didn't invite her in immediately. I let her stand there. I need to say this to you properly, she said. So please let me finish. I stepped back. She came inside. We sat at the kitchen table. It started, she said, when you got engaged. Which sounds terrible, but that's when it started. Mom called me the day after the engagement party and she was so excited about the wedding, your wedding, and she was already talking about the table arrangements and the dress and which relatives to invite. And I felt like I was watching someone plan a celebration for the person who had always gotten celebrated and I was just there. Adjacent. I'm not saying that's your fault. I'm saying that's what I felt. Marcus and I had been talking about a trip for 2 years. His work schedule, my schedule, there was one window, and it was September. And I knew what I was doing. I knew what I was choosing. But I told myself, and Mom helped me tell myself this, that you were the strong one. That you didn't need us the way I needed you. That you had Daniel and Simone and 60 other people who loved you, and this was the one thing that was mine. I asked Mom to call you with the passport story. That was me. She didn't want to at first, I need you to know that she hesitated. But I convinced her because I'm very good at convincing Mom of things. And she loves me in a way that makes her choices sometimes very small. And Simone I shouldn't have involved. That was wrong. That was me using someone who cared about you to protect myself. The photo. I didn't think about the timestamp. I posted it and didn't think. And when I saw that people had noticed, I set the account to private and I told myself it would never come up. That's who I was in this. Someone who did a thing and then tried to make sure she didn't have to look at it. What I did to you on September 14th, I will carry that. I do carry it. Marcus and I stood on that terrace and I kept thinking about you. The wine sat on the table for 20 minutes before I touched it because I couldn't stop thinking about what was happening at that barn while I was standing there. That's not absolution. I'm not telling you so you'll feel sorry for me. I'm telling you because you deserve to know that I knew what it cost and I did it anyway, and that is the most honest thing I've ever said to you. November became December. The light in Ohio in December is something specific, low and silvered, arriving late and leaving early, giving everything a quality of compression, as if the days are held in parentheses. I have always loved it in a way I could never quite explain. Daniel knew everything by now. I had told him the full story on a Tuesday night, sitting at the kitchen table with the remnants of dinner between us, and he had listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, and when I finished he had said, "What do you need from me?" Not "here's what I think you should do," not "I can't believe them," just, "What do you need?" I had needed, that night, for him to sit with me on the couch and watch something completely meaningless on television, and that's exactly what we did. That was its own kind of love. The kind I had chosen well. My mother called 6 times in November. I let 4 go to voicemail. I answered the 5th because it was a Tuesday morning and I was on a free period, and something in the pattern of the calls, their frequency, their evenness, told me she had something specific to say. She did. "Krista and Marcus are thinking of doing a real wedding ceremony in the spring," she said. "Something small, at the house. And we were wondering, your father and I were wondering, whether you might be able to help with some of the costs. Since you and Daniel didn't do a honeymoon yet, and Krista's budget is." I actually laughed. Just once, involuntarily, a single sound of pure disbelief that escaped before I could contain it. My mother stopped speaking. "I need to make sure I heard you correctly," I said. "You're asking me to contribute money to Krista's wedding celebration. When you say it like that. How should I say it?" A pause. Then, with the careful precision of someone who has thought about this more than they're letting on, "You've always been generous, Nora. We thought you'd want to be included." Included. The word was almost beautiful in its audacity. I had been excluded from the planning dinner. I had been managed and maneuvered and kept in the dark. I had received white lilies I was allergic to as compensation for my parents' absence at my own wedding. And now the invitation to participate, to be included, arrived in the form of a request for my money. I understood, in that moment, something I hadn't been able to name before. This was not a family that had made a single terrible choice under pressure. This was a dynamic that had been operating, quietly and consistently, for most of my life. I had been positioned as the capable one, the generous one, the one who understood, not because those things weren't true, but because they were useful. My reliability had been a resource. My emotional generosity had been a budget they drew from without accounting for. I had participated in this. I had to own that. I had needed to be needed, had built my sense of value around being the one who helped, who held, who managed. That need had made me easy to lean on and difficult to see clearly. I had confused being indispensable with being loved, and for a long time the confusion had felt like enough. "No," I said. "Just that. One syllable." My mother made a sound, not quite a word. "I won't be contributing to the celebration. I need more time before I'm ready to be in regular contact. When I'm ready, I'll reach out." I hung up for the second time in 3 weeks without apologizing, and this time my hands didn't shake at all. Spring came later than usual that year, April already before the trees made any real commitment to green. I had started seeing a therapist named Celia in January, a woman in her 50s who had a succulent collection on her windowsill and an unhurried way of asking questions that made me feel, for the first time in my adult life, that the answer I gave didn't have to be the comforting one. I told Celia about the supply closet. About holding my hand flat on the shelf and surviving the moment and going back to teach watercolor to 28 children. She said, "That's very telling, what you did there." I asked her what it told her. She said, that you've been surviving things and calling it strength for a very long time. That sentence cracked something open in me that took weeks to process. Not the strength part, the surviving part. The distinction between the two was something I had never let myself examine. I had called my composure resilience. I had called my compliance maturity. I had called my silence wisdom and my self-erasure grace. None of those renamings were wrong, exactly, but none of them were fully honest either. I had spent years being good at the wrong things. At keeping the peace, at not asking, at making everything look fine from the outside. And I had told myself that was virtue. In March, Simone and I had coffee. Our first time since November. I had been the one to reach out, which felt right. She had respected what I'd asked and not pushed, and that restraint had meant more to me than any number of apologies would have. We sat at Gravel and Grounds, at our usual table, and it was awkward for the first 10 minutes and then it wasn't. We didn't resolve everything. We didn't try to. What we did was sit together and be honest about how much had broken and how much might still be worth keeping. That felt like the most real conversation we had ever had. Krista and I talked twice on the phone. I was not ready for more than that, and I told her so directly, which was itself a new thing for me. The Nora I was before September would have said I just need a little time, made it soft, made it easy, left the door open in a way that suggested I would be manageable again soon. This Nora said, I'm not ready for regular contact. I'll tell you when that changes. Krista said she understood. I think she meant it. I think she was also relieved to have a boundary she could work around rather than an expectation she kept failing. My mother and I would find our way back to something. Not the same thing, not the arrangement where she carried my emotional availability like a resource she could draw down without replenishing. Something smaller. More honestly proportioned. I didn't know yet what it would look like, and I had stopped trying to predict it. What I did know, Daniel and I booked a honeymoon in April. Portugal, a week in Lisbon and the Douro Valley, cork forests and terraced vineyards, and the kind of light that makes you feel briefly like you are living inside a painting. We ate well. We walked slowly. We sat on a terrace one evening with wine and the valley below us and no particular need to say anything, and I understood something in that quiet that I had been circling for months. I had spent my whole life being someone's version of me. The capable daughter. The reliable friend. The one who holds it together. And those things were real, they were genuinely me, part of me, but they had been turned into a role, and I had played the role so completely that I had stopped noticing the gap between who I was performing and who I actually was. On that terrace, in the April light, I wasn't performing anything. I was just a woman with a glass of wine and a husband she loved and a year that had cost her something real but also returned something she hadn't known was missing. That felt like enough to start with. The lilies, I had quietly stopped forgiving. Some things you carry not as wounds but as information. What my family had done told me something true about how I had been seen, and I was allowed to know that without erasing it for anyone's comfort. That was new for me. Holding accurate information about someone you love without immediately softening it into something more bearable. I was still learning how to do it. But I was no longer pretending the learning wasn't necessary. My students, that spring, made a mural. A whole classroom wall, a garden of invented flowers, no real species, just color and shape and the specific creative confidence of children who haven't yet been told there's a wrong way to make a flower. One boy named Ellis made something that was half sunflower, half something else entirely, in a shade of orange that shouldn't have worked with the surrounding colors but somehow did. I hung it prominently. I told him it was brave. He looked at me seriously and said, I just made it how I wanted it to look. I thought about that for a long time afterward. There's something specifically painful about realizing that the role you built your life around, the dependable one, the strong one, the one who holds it together, was never chosen by you. It was assigned. And you accepted it not because it fit, but because you were young when it was handed to you, and you didn't know you were allowed to put it down. Nora didn't walk into this story blind. She walked into it trained. Trained to prioritize other people's comfort over her own clarity, to interpret her own perceptions as overreaction, to call her silence wisdom and her compliance generosity. The family system she grew up in didn't produce a victim, it produced a function. Someone so reliably absorptive that her capacity to be hurt had been effectively discounted from the family budget. What makes this story psychologically complex is that no single moment was the betrayal. The betrayal was cumulative, built from a decade of small decisions in which Nora's needs were consistently treated as secondary, and she consistently agreed to that treatment by not naming it. The passport story was not the beginning of anything. It was simply the moment the weight became impossible to carry quietly. Diane, the mother, is perhaps the most uncomfortable figure in this story precisely because her love is real. She genuinely believes she knows her daughters. But she has confused knowledge with convenience. She knows the version of Nora that makes her life easier, and she has stopped interrogating whether that version is complete. When she tells Nora that she's the strong one, the one who manages, she means it as a compliment. That's the depth of the blind spot. She is not calculating. She is simply incurious about her eldest daughter's actual inner life, because Nora has never required her curiosity. Krista's confession carries genuine shame, and the story asks us to hold that against her genuine selfishness simultaneously. She knew what she was choosing. The detail of the wine sitting untouched on the Santorini terrace, that image of her standing with Marcus, thinking about the barn, unable to start the celebration she had chosen over her sisters, is not presented as redemption. It is presented as evidence of what she was, someone who could see the cost clearly and choose it anyway, and live inside that contradiction long enough to come out the other side and confess it. The most significant structural betrayal in this story is Simone. Because family can be written off as enmeshed and biased and caught in old patterns. A friend who stands at your altar and holds your hand while keeping a secret of that magnitude, that is a different kind of calculation. Simone described it as being pulled in before she understood the commitment. That may be true. But she had 6 months, and an altar, and a hand to squeeze, and she did not speak. What Nora learns, and this is the quiet center of the story, is the difference between being needed and being loved. She had spent her life confusing them. Being needed feels like love when you are a child and the adults in your life have made your usefulness central to the family's functioning. It takes a long time to understand that love without consistent regard for your actual well-being is not the complete thing. That a family can need you and still not truly see you. The ending is not triumphant. It is honest. Portugal, the mural, the boy named Ellis making his flower in a color that shouldn't work but does, these are images of a woman who has stopped performing and started inhabiting. Who has taken the most painful year of her adult life and used it to excavate something real. She didn't get her family back. She got something more durable, a clear picture of who they are, what she needs, and what she is no longer willing to give away for free. What stays with me most about this story isn't the wedding, or the Instagram post, or even the request for honeymoon money, though that last one arrives like a kind of punchline to a joke that was never funny. What stays is the image of Nora in the supply closet. Sitting on an overturned plastic bin, surrounded by construction paper, pressing her hand flat against the shelf. Not crying. Not falling apart. Just holding on and then going back to teach. She had been doing that her whole life. Holding on quietly, going back to function, and calling it strength. The thing I keep thinking about is how long it takes to recognize a pattern you were raised inside. You can't see the walls of a room you've always lived in. The real work isn't the confrontation is almost the easy part, the moment the pressure finally finds its exit. The real work is the quieter undoing afterward, the slow process of distinguishing between who you genuinely are and who you were shaped to be for everyone else's convenience. Nora didn't just lose her family's presence at her wedding. She lost the story she had been telling herself about who she was to them. That story was comfortable, even as it cost her. Grieving it was real. And building something more honest in its place, that takes longer, and hurts differently, and matters more.